Folk Studio 451 is proud to present Pioneer History of Orleans County, New York by Arad Thomas, edited and annotated by A. Burris. Chapter 8. Hardships and Privations. The scarcity of bread and breadstuffs before the war, and even down to 1818, is to be numbered among the hardships and privations which beset the settlers. Even when they could get a bushel of wheat or corn, the difficulty in reducing the grain to flour or meal was truly formidable. The nearest mill was 15 to 30 miles away. There was no road leading to it and probably no horse to draw or carry the grist if a road had been opened. But meal must be had, and so the undaunted emigrant would hitch his oxen to his sled or wagon, pile on a bag for himself, take as many bags for his neighbors as the occasion required, and start for some mill. We will leave imagination to describe his journey. After 3 or 4 days' absence, it is announced in the settlement that Mr. A has gotten back from the mill, and marvelously soon each family would be eating pudding or having a cake. But what if the family had no neighbors, no horse or ox to carry their grist? Still, the grist must go at once, and so its owner would shoulder half a bushel or a bushel, according to his strength, and carry it to the mill, be the distance what it may, threading his way past marked trees to make it through the woods. Such journeys were not thought of lightly, and they were honestly performed. Some of the settlers made and used a sort of domestic mill in which corn could be reduced to meal. They would make a mortar from a hollow in the top of a hardwood stump, rig a heavy pestle on a spring pole over the mortar, and thus pound the corn fine enough to be cooked. But even if the newcomers had enough bread and enough to spare, they all had to pay a penalty to nature in the acclimating process, which they all went through almost without exception. Fever and ague attacked the pioneer, his wife, his children, or all of them together whenever an opening was made in the forest, or the earth was turned up for the first time to the hot rays of the summer sun. Oh, the amount of quinine and blue pill consumed in those days, by those who could get a doctor to prescribe in their case. Meanwhile, those sick ones who had no doctor because there was none to be had, wore out their ague and let it work itself off the natural way. They generally came out about as well as those who doctored and tried to break it, except they took more time to do it. The first professional doctors who came in were most intensely allopathic in their practice and dealt out quinine and blue pill in most heroic doses to their patients. Infinitesimal prescriptions and homeopathic practice had not then been thought of. Another privation, if not a hardship, was the lack of post offices and mail facilities. Most of the pioneers came from New England, which they and their fathers regarded as a civilized country, and where they had always had all the post office accommodations they wanted. It was rather hard to be shut out completely from the outer world. The first settlers in Orleans County got their letters from Batavia or Clarkson, and they did not take newspapers by mail. The first winter was a hard time for the pioneer to keep his cattle on account of the scarcity of fodder. It took several years to clear the trees and get a crop of hay grown in their places. A year or two was required before corn stalks or straw could be produced. If nobody in the neighborhood had fodder to sell, the new settler had to cut down trees for his cattle to browse or feed upon the boughs. This was a work of immense labor, especially in severe cold weather and deep snows. It was a sad time for the poor cattle, compelled to lie out exposed to all storms and feeding on such a diet. Special care had to be taken to keep the fire from going out in their dwellings, as it was so difficult to recover it again. An instance is given of such a loss in the house of Widow Gilbert in Gaines, who, returning from the funeral of her husband, found the fire was out and no means at hand to kindle it. Fire had to be procured from the nearest neighbors, who were several miles away. Tinder boxes and powder horns were the usual resorts in such cases, but these might be out as well as fires. Friction matches had not yet been invented, and it was an inconvenience at least to be deprived of soft water. The bark roof of a log cabin was a poor contrivance for collecting it when there was no snow to melt. The hard water from the ground was prepared for washing clothes by cleansing, as they called it, by putting in wood ashes enough to form a weak lye. The Holland Company commonly sold their lands for a small down payment and gave a contract extending payments for the balance from 5 to 10 years, with interest annually after about 2 years. This seemed to be a good bargain to the settler at first, for, although he was poor, he felt hopeful and strong. He went into the woods to begin his clearing, sanguine in the belief that he could meet his payments as they fell due from the produce of his land, besides paying the necessary expenses of his living and his improvements. But after a year or two, a part of his family is taken sick, doctors and nurses must be paid, and stock, a team, tools, furniture, and provisions must be bought. He may have cleared a few acres, built a log cabin, and raised some crops, more than was needed for home consumption. But he could not sell the surplus. The road to market was impassable for teams, and if the roads had been opened, it was hard work at best to pay for land by raising wheat at the price of 30 cents a bushel. Is it surprising that under circumstances like these, some of the earlier settlers of this county, after toiling several years and finding themselves constantly running behind, got discouraged and wanted to sell out and go away? Many would have sold their claims and left the country or gone anyway, whether they sold or not if the land company had enforced their legal rights on their articles as they fell due. But the company was lenient. They gave off interest due them, and sometimes principal, in cases of great hardship to the settler. Many times when he went to the land office to say he could not make his payments and must give it up, the agents of the company, finding him industrious and frugal, trying to do the best he could, would meet him with such words of kindness, generous encouragement, and cheer that he would go back to his home with fresh courage to renew his battle with the mosquitoes, the ague, and the bears, and wait a little longer for the good time coming. Only a few were able to take deeds of their lands and pay for them until after the Erie Canal was navigable. They kept on clearing land and enlarging their fields, and between the years 1830 and 1836, good crops of wheat were raised and sold at the canal for about $1 a bushel. The clouds of gloom began to lift from the face of the county. Prosperity had come. There were no more hardships, privations, and sufferings after that, and more deeds of land were taken from the Holland Company in this county in those years than were given in all others together. Despite their many challenges, the pioneers never succumbed to present hardships or lost their great hope for the future. They had their joys as well as griefs running along their pathway together. Social amusements, conviviality, fun, and good feeling were intermingled with their sadder experiences. They visited together, labored for and with each other. They exchanged work in chopping, logging, and in heavy toil on their lands, where several together could work at better advantage than alone. They were given to hospitality. They aided, assisted, and helped one another with a liberality and kindness that seems remarkable in contrast with the selfishness of older society. If a family came in who had not built themselves a cabin for their residence in advance, they had no difficulty finding a stopping place with almost any settler who had a house until a log house could be built. And the best of it was that all the men in the neighborhood assembled at ague and built a log house gratis for their new friends if it was necessary. If a man fell sick in seed time or harvest and could not do his work, his neighbors would turn in and sow his seed or gather his crop for him. If a family was out of provisions, everybody who had a stock shared with the needy ones. A happy feature of this primitive society was the absence of caste, which divided people into classes and made social distinctions. Everybody was considered just as good and no better than everybody else. All met and mingled in terms of social equality. At the dancing parties, quilting frolics, weddings, and other gatherings of the people for social enjoyment, everybody in the neighborhood was invited, whether they wore store clothes or common homespun, and commonly everyone attended. People were generally acquainted with everybody near them. Old people who lived during that time say that for several years they knew every family in town and often visited with them, walking miles through the woods by marked trees to meet together. Clearing the forest and undertaking the heavy work of establishing settlements in the woods was the primary task of the pioneers. Through this experience, they learned to value the ability to excel in all aspects of their work. Hence, at their loggings, raisings, and other assemblings for work or play, friendly trials of strength or skill found favor. Contests in chopping, lifting, cutting wheat, and other tests of muscle were common, and seldom did a number of young men meet on a festive occasion without forming a ring for wrestling. The pioneers at their first coming here were generally young. They were resolute, intelligent, determined, and persistent, for no others would quit the comparative ease, safety, and comfort of older society to encounter the certain hardships, perils, and discouragements of frontier settlement in the woods in such a country as this. The true grit of the emigrant was proved by the fact that he came here. Such men were not to be driven back by hardships, want, sickness, or misfortune. While the settler's hope and resolution could not protect him from sickness and calamity, they filled him with fortitude to endure them, and gave him a keen relish for enjoying whatever in his way might afford a pleasure. Looking at these pioneers from the standpoint of the present day, an observer might well conclude they were as happy then as their descendants are now on the same ground. Many who began here in poverty and want, who worked their way through every difficulty to wealth and abundance, have often said that in their old age, their happiest days in life were spent in their old log houses, away back among the stumps. Early merchants, their stores and goods. Soon after the settlement of this county, asheries were built. In these early days, the large quantities of wood ash produced in burning the log heaps, made while clearing land, were an easier source of money than crops of grain. The lye obtained was boiled down to a semi-solid state known as black salts, which were then sold to Mr. James Mather, or another ashery owner. These facilities processed the black salts into potash and palash, a refined type of potash that has since been replaced by saleratus. These products of ashes brought some money and were taken by the merchants in exchange for their goods. Before the canal was made, merchants' goods were brought in by water, by way of Lake Ontario, or on wagons from Albany. Robert Hunter and his brothers of Eagle Harbor were teamsters who traveled to and from Albany with large teams of horses hitched to wagons. They brought in most of the goods used here for several years until later when they came by way of the canal. A wagon load would go a great way in stocking a store. The substantial delivery of whiskey included in the supplies was sufficient to meet home consumption needs. Merchants did not then, as now, confine their trade to a single line of goods such as hardware, drugs, or groceries. In the common language of their advertisements, their stock comprised all the articles usually called for at a county store, which meant everything the people wanted to buy at a store. The wants of the settlers were few and simple in the line of such goods. They confined their purchases to articles of prime necessity, which they could not well do without, such as tools to work with and building materials which did not grow upon their land, an occasional calico dress, and a few kinds of utensils, such as they could not make at home. These goods were generally bought on credit, with a promise to pay when the merchant went to New York, a journey he undertook about twice a year. These debts were not all paid when due, and many of them were collected by legal process, and many of them were lost to their owners. The credit system was bad for both parties in many cases. Before the canal was made, people found it very difficult to pay their store debts. Though they had a large and good farm, plenty of the finest wheat, and possibly a stock of cattle, hogs, and horses, they had no money and could not sell their possessions for money, as they could not get it to a market. About the time the canal became navigable, timber was plentiful, and sawmills were built. Sawed lumber paid many store debts. Soon wheat, pork, flour, and all kinds of produce that could go to market on the canal were found to be ready for sale at fair prices, and thus debts could be paid. Domestic manufacturers. Most of the early settlers were New England Yankees of that class who, if they wanted something, made it. With very few tools and those of the simplest kinds, they made almost everything required that could be produced from the materials on hand. They brought a few clothes with them. When these were worn out, they supplied their wants with cloth made at home. The women made the common articles of clothing for their families. If the man needed a new coat or other garment his wife did not feel competent to make, the cloth was taken to someone properly skilled to be cut out, and a tailoress would come to his house and make it up. These itinerant seamstresses did most of the needlework required by the family, and which they could not do themselves. The modern classification of needlewomen into milliners, manteau makers, dressmakers, etc. did not then prevail. The people got their leather made by neighboring tanners, and from such stock, a traveling shoemaker visited the houses of his customers and made and mended their shoes and boots. The boys and girls and some of the older folks commonly went barefoot in the summer and often likewise in the winter. Post Office and Mail. Mr. Merwin S. Hawley of Buffalo, son of Judge Elijah Hawley, who resided in Ridgeway in his boyhood, speaking from his recollections, says, "In 1815, the only mail to and through Ridgeway was carried on horseback twice a week between Canandaigua and Lewiston. On October 22, 1816, a post office was established at Ridgeway Corners, named Oak Orchard, with Elijah Hawley appointed as the postmaster. At that time, the mail was carried in 2-horse carriages, 3 times a week each way, stopping overnight at Huff's Tavern in East Gaines. A year later, on August 24, 1817, another post office was established at Oak Orchard Creek on the Ridge, which was then growing to be a smart village. James Brown was appointed postmaster there. To make the names of the offices conform to their locations, the new post office was called Oak Orchard, and the name of the other was changed to Ridgeway, with Mr. Hawley holding the office of postmaster there until his death. During this year, 1817, a daily line of mail stages, each way between Rochester and Lewiston on the Ridge Road, was commenced. A post office was established at Gaines on July 1, 1816, with William J. Babbitt appointed as postmaster. The next post office in Orleans County was located at Shelby Center and got its mail from Ridgeway. Other post offices were located in other parts of the county from time to time, as the wants of increasing population required.
Learn more about this series at pioneerhistory.us.